Hello, and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. The History with Jackson podcast is presented by Past and Present Media, the home of accessible history. So thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of History with Jackson. Today in our episode we're talking to Kenneth MacInnes all about Russia and democracy, and I think you're really going to love this conversation. It's a great conversation. We examine so many different parts of Russian history. But first, before we go into the episode, we're going to have a little message from our supporters, and then I'll leave you in the hands of Kenneth. Now, you might know that the Historians magazine is the other history product that I am involved in. Now, I think this magazine is really important and really great for everyone because it is the magazine by historians for historians. The Historians magazine tries to make history accessible for all so that everyone can try and learn something and get involved in some history that they want to get involved and learn about. Now, the Historians magazine isn't just one magazine. We also have a kids magazine called the Little Historians magazine, which is based around the national curriculum for primary school children, and there is also the great podcast hosted by yours truly called the Historians magazine podcast. Go check them all out because it really is a great place to learn about different histories in an accessible and entertaining way. So that is the Historians magazine. Now, here at History of Jackson, I really enjoy bringing different history content to you every month. And one place that I get my history content from is Accessible Art History, the podcast. This is a podcast for you if you are fascinated by the history of art and culture and you want to learn more about works of art, famous artists, or exciting archaeological discoveries. Accessible Art History aims to provide to you free quality art history content for anyone who is curious. It is committed to history, knowledge, content, and having fun whilst learning. I really enjoy learning my art history from Accessible Art History, the podcast. So if you want to learn more about art history, head to Accessible Art History, the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any major podcast player. That is Accessible Art History, the podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast. Today we are talking with Kenneth MacInnes all about his book, With Amberley, When Russia Did Democracy, from St. Vladimir to Tsar Putin. How are you doing, Kenneth?
I'm very well, thank you. Summer's arrived and it's sunny here where I am, and I hope that's the same for you.
Yes, yeah, it's been incredibly hot, so I've been trying to keep in the shade. And I must say, I really enjoyed reading your book, and I'm really excited to get into a conversation about it today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the welcome.
No, so it's okay. So, first question I want to ask you really is, what inspired you to write this book? Because obviously it's you're covering a breadth of history here, and I'd be interested to find out what inspired you.
Well, I was a student of the Russian language, and as part of my university course, I had to spend a year living in Russia to really learn the language. And so I showed up in the Soviet Union in 1991, just when it was going through its very democratic transformations, revolutions, you might even say. And so it was very interesting to see all that history in the process. Then I ended up living in the country for the next 20 years, 10 years through the democratic 1990s, and then 10 years under the first decade of Putinism. And just from living there, I found things that were very democratic, different to our own system, that interest me. For example, I worked for 13 years at an art museum, and there the staff voted or elected their director and deputy director, which you don't get in, for example, the Tate or the National Gallery. I owned an apartment, and when you paid your rates, if you weren't happy with something, with your roof wasn't being fixed, then you could just strike out the payment for that. And so all these things, like what I would call democracy, which means power, people having real power. And that was besides watching the television. It was very free, it was very liberal, it was a bit anarchic, and just observing the politics as well, where there was complete plurality in a way which just seems unthinkable today under Putin. And looking back at that time, I feel it's like it was seeing now from the position where we are today, it was like an island of democracy within the two great oceans of communism and then Putinism, which is now well into its third decade. So I wanted to write about the 1990s, but then when I started writing a sort of foreword of what came before then, I found the democracy even before then was even more interesting when you start to dig deeper. And when I returned to the UK, I worked for a time for Parliament in London, where my job was also to promote democracy. And it generally got me thinking about what does real democracy mean, and how can we really achieve democracy? And are there lessons to be learned from studying how other countries approach the idea of democracy and people power?
I think it's really interesting there how your kind of lived experience of Russia between, I quite like that phrase, between the two islands of communism and Putinism, really informed your research and informed your book, because those themes of communism and Putinism and democracy are present throughout, really. Now, we're looking at the Russian state, and today you look at a behemoth that's incredibly huge and spans or spans two continents, really. And looking at the USSR, you have an even bigger entity. Where does this state originate from then?
Right. So basically the date 862 AD is generally the date that's taken as the start of the Russian state, and actually, for that matter, both Russia and also Ukraine and Belarus. So we're back, just as a bit of context, even with it's similar to what was happening in our own countries, Scotland and England. So we're at about the time of Alfred the Great. Scotland, for example, it became a kingdom, a unified kingdom, just 19 years before Russia. 843, England generally thought of as being unified in year 927. And then at the same time, also in Europe, you have the Vikings going round, setting up states at the exact same time in the Duchy of Normandy or in Sicily. And they were doing the exact same thing. They weren't just going to the west, they were also going to the east, traveling through the future Russian lands, down to along the rivers, down to Constantinople and the Black Sea. And they set up a state in the future Russian state called Rus, after the name of the tribe which is believed to have come from Scandinavia to set up this first state, the Rus. And now the lands were occupied by generally East Slavic tribes. There were also some Finno-Ugric and Turkic tribes. And we know about them just as we know a lot about, say, in Britain, we know about the Celts from the Roman historians. Also, we know a little bit, although the East Slavic tribes didn't have literacy at that time, we know about them from the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire historians. And they chronicle that in the 6th century, they were living under democracy. So they governed themselves, and they had through an assembly called the Veche. It comes from the Old Slavonic root vete, which is also the same origin as the word Soviet. And it was like a Soviet, councils, just assemblies, where they democratically decided their own affairs. So when the Scandinavians came, that's in the late 9th century, it was almost they set up a state, but the people there, they were already running themselves. And now, according to the official history, according to the primary chronicle, which admittedly it was written a couple of centuries after this event in 862, the people of Novgorod, that's the part closest to Scandinavia in Russia, they invited this prince of the Rus, a man called Rurik, to come and rule over them, to be like a figurehead, because they already had their, as you said, their own council. And it was interesting that he was invited to come and rule over them, but he wasn't allowed to live in the capital, Novgorod, in case he took over with his own detachment. So the Novgorod is where the state begins. But then 20 years later, Rurik's successor, a man called Oleg, traveled down south to the city of Kiev, which was a much richer city already in existence. And he made Kiev the capital of what became eventually a sort of federation of principalities of these East Slavic tribes. And so the initial state, it was called Kievan Rus, because named after the Rus tribe, and Kievan because Kiev was the capital.
You can definitely see some roots of what's happening today within these historical discussions, and the context as well around what some people are saying about this conflict. But I want to pick on an interesting point there, because the date that we're looking at is incredibly early for a democracy like this. So what was happening in Novgorod how different was what was happening in Novgorod to what was happening elsewhere?
Well, it was very interesting, and it was very much ahead of its time. For a start, in Novgorod was a direct democracy, which is already interesting of its own accord. And it wasn't just an ancient city-state like, say, Athens or a small Swiss canton, because Novgorod actually, it eventually grew into almost like a large colonial empire, which covered the entire northern half of European Russia. And so in the capital, Novgorod, the Vichy, the Central Assembly, which took all the decisions, passed all the laws, heard all court proceedings, elected all officials. That was just in the capital, and in the districts, in other towns and in villages, they had their own Vichy. So in a way, you had direct democracy across this whole country. So in that sense, direct democracy, it was a little like the ancient city-states, but it was also very ahead of its time, very modern in a way. In like the Vichy, it had procedures, it had positions, almost like the same as in the House of Commons today, with officials like the Sergeant at Arms who keeps order, the leader of the House who introduces the bills, and they even had political parties. And we're talking about this is about the time of the 12th century, when England didn't even have the beginnings of its House of Commons, and they had the equivalent of political parties. Now they weren't so much ideological. They were based on the 5 districts of Novgorod. So there were 5 parties, but still somewhere, because some districts were richer than others, so there was a sort of economic and slight class interest there. But this also meant that there was constant competition for power, because as I say, one of the very interesting things was that all posts were elected. And so you only, didn't matter if you were the prince, the archbishop, or just maybe like a local leader, you only held that post for as long as you had the confidence of the electorate. Once you lost that, you were out of your job. So you could stay in your job maybe for a number of years, or maybe even just a couple of days or weeks. And incidentally, this also applied even to the church. Novgorod, they had a very interesting take on religion. It was the Russian Orthodox Church, but they elected their own church officials, including the archbishop, and they could remove them from power if they wanted. There was one time they went through a very long period of rainy weather, and so that for that reason they decided to get rid of the archbishop. And when they elected an archbishop, what even was interesting was the church officials were not allowed to take part, and it was the people who elected the church officials. And then whoever was archbishop was then sent to the Metropolitan of Kiev to be officially endorsed. So there was a whole, and as I said, so you have these political parties, and so if you wanted to be like the prime minister, it was called the Posadnik, you had to have keep the support of either one party or sometimes even a coalition of parties. And over the 400 period of Novgorod's history, there was a general fair representation of each of these parties. So there was a whole system of checks and balances, and no dynasty or elite civil service could become entrenched, because obviously civil service, you were only in power for while you were popular, while you had public confidence. Also, dynasty, they had a prince. It was like a figurehead that they could that they themselves would elect and remove from power if they wanted to, and they actually did that very often. For example, one of their princes is the famous Alexander Nevsky, who won a very popular figure at the moment in Putin's Russia, who won the famous Battle of the Neva in 1240 over the Swedes. But that same year, the people of Novgorod, after his military triumph, the people of Novgorod just got rid of him. But then they invited him back the following year in good time, when they had another battle, the Battle of the Ice over the Teutonic Knights in 1242. So it was both, it had its roots back in the sort of original Greek democracy, but it was also very modern looking, and also had points which could, in which possibly we are deficient even today. It did have its that was how it all was on paper. Of course, it wasn't perfect. Over the 400 years, in the second half, it became oligarchic, which is maybe a good lesson for us in democracy, just how to make sure democracy always stays on path, because it's just a good historical example what went wrong with this very good democracy, and it just gradually sort of evolved into an oligarchy, which is actually what you saw happening a lot in some of the Greek city-states.
It's quite interesting there that you can see a lot of parallels between how some democracies are today, and even when you're talking about the different structures and the checks and balances and the procedures, you can see some parallels with the British system. And then when you talk about an oligarchy, you can see some parallels with the later Soviet and Russian systems. So in the 1500s, around this era, we have the rise of Muscovy or Moscow. How did this power rise to power, and what happens with this?
Well, it was the Mongol invasion which interrupted things and shook things up a little bit, because the Mongol occupation of Rus happened basically for about just over 200 years, from 1240 to 1480. Now, the Mongols didn't really interfere in the internal workings of what was happening in Rus. They just wanted to collect taxes and be sure that the territories were subjugated. They weren't all occupied, and that's the reason why we have Ukraine and Belarus today, because parts of which are now Russia fell more under the Mongol influence, while the western parts, now Ukraine, Belarus, they fell under the more western influence of Poland and Lithuania. But what happened was, so Kiev, Kiev declined even before that, and there were other cities emerged like Vladimir and Suzdal, and there's like an analogy of a forest where you've got the big trees and they don't let the other trees grow because they cover them with shade. This is what it was a bit like with these big towns. So the Mongols came, they chopped down the big trees, and that let the sort of smaller shrubs grow themselves into bigger trees. Places like Moscow or Tver, which were hidden by forests, they were also destroyed at various times by the Mongols. But because they were left alone, more in slightly quieter forested areas, they were able to emerge themselves and grow during this time of the Mongol occupation, the Mongol yoke, as it's known in Russian history. And Moscow grew specifically simply because of the character and nature of its princes. Now, Moscow was very cunning. on the one hand, it collaborated with the Mongols. For example, the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan Kalitin, he became the main tax collector for the whole of Rus. So he collected all the taxes and then handed the money over to the Mongols. Obviously, that made him a very, very rich man. And he also helped to put down anti-Mongol rebellions, which happened in the territory of Rus, for example, in the neighboring Principality of Tver, which got him into, of course, got him in the good books of the Mongols, and it also had the benefit of helping to put down a potential neighboring rival. So, and on the other hand, the Moscow positioned itself as kind of like the spiritual head of the Russian people, the metropolitan, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, moved to Moscow in 1325, so it became the seat of like spiritual power. Also, there was Dmitry Donskoy, another prince of Moscow. He led the Russian forces at the Battle of Kulikovo, which was the first time when the Russians stood up to the Mongols and gave them a bloody nose. They didn't chase them out because the Mongol yoke continued for about another 100 years. But so this did position kind of like Moscow as both using both sword and diplomacy to kind of emerge as the leading power in Rus. And all this time, they were copying the Mongols because they introduced, for example, things which had not existed before the Mongol invasion in Rus, like the segregation of women, capital and corporal punishment. And so when the Mongols finally went away, because first of all, the Mongol Empire split up into 4 parts. And the western part, the Golden Horde, which controlled Rus, or Russia, as the name became increasingly Europeanized, the Golden Horde itself began to weaken, and eventually in 1480, after another battle, or rather a standoff between Mongol and Russian troops, the Russians decided that we aren't going to pay any more tribute to you, and so you had Russia independent again, but this time it wasn't Kievan Rus, it was Muscovite Rus with Moscow at the head controlling everything.
And it's really fascinating to see the different power dynamics in there and those different methods that Moscow was able to utilize to come out on top in that particular region. Now, I want to zoom forward a couple of hundred years to 1613. And there's a name here that people might recognize, and it's Michael Romanov. And he becomes Tsar in this year. How important is this moment in 1613 where Michael becomes Tsar?
Well, it's very important. A lot of he becomes Tsar, and a lot of the arguments used against, for example, having a royal family. For example, in our country, it can be said that, they're only king or queen because their ancestors robbed our ancestors. And without even going into the wrongs or rights of that argument, this is one argument that could not be used against the Romanov dynasty, because although they're second only to the Bolsheviks, in my book, is getting a bad rap as enemies of democracy, they were actually democratically elected in 1613. What happened was, before then, Russia had gone through a period of great turmoil known as the Time of Troubles, when the dynasty, which is stretched back to the time of Rurik, ended shortly after Ivan the Terrible died. Then there was a great period of turmoil, pretenders, and finally the Russian people sorted out everything themselves by setting up their own democracy called the Council of the Land and expelling all the foreign invaders, Poles, and also Swedes from the country. So the people righted themselves and sort of restored the Russian state in 1612. But instead of, and they'd already set up their own, by that time, set up their own functioning government, but instead of keeping power to themselves, they wanted to go back to having a Tsar, because they felt that the problems had begun when they tried actually having an elected Tsar, Boris Godunov, and it was as if that went against the laws of God. So they wanted to get back to how things had been before this time of troubles. And so they held an election for a new Tsar, and their choice was Michael Romanov, who actually, the irony is that he didn't stand for election himself. He was just chosen as a compromise candidate because he was both Russian and he was also linked to the previous, the very first dynasty through Ivan the Terrible's first wife, Anastasia Romanova. And however, maybe the problem that the people made when he was elected in 1613 was that there were no conditions set to his reign. So after him, his son Alexis, when he died in 1645, his son Alexis also became Tsar. And as far as we know, as part of his election, he wasn't made to sign any actual conditions which would place limitations on his power. It might have happened, but there are only second-hand or third-hand accounts of this. If there were, it wasn't documented. So people elect a new dynasty. It's an elected dynasty, but it is also at the same time a return to the times of the Muscovite, the autocratic princes, or as it now became known, Tsar and eventually Emperor.
It seems to me that a lot of the issues with the powers of the Tsars and the Emperors stem from those lack of conditions imposed on Michael Romanov. Now, he has two very, very interesting descendants who I want to talk about now, and they are the I'm not even going to try and say that word. The two very different emperors of Alexander II and Alexander III. I want to kind of look at a different topic that we don't quite look at with these two. You know, what was their relationship with democracy like?
Yes, you're correct. They're very different, although father and son. So Alexander II came to power during the Crimean War when his own father, Nicholas I, died. Now, Nicholas I was very reactionary. And the Crimean War was really the result of all these reactionary policies when Russia was seen not to be able to even conduct a war in its own in its own lands in Crimea. So Alexander II, on assuming power, he understood things had to change very radically. And he was supported by members of his family, his brother Constantine, his aunt, who was German, and he immediately embarked on a period of reforms. Most importantly of all, he was the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, but he also carried out judicial and army reforms, which proved to be very good reforms, as shown when the Russian army had successes against the Ottoman Empire in the 1870s. Being liberal, it was not quite the same as being a Democrat, as believing in democracy, because Alexander II was very similar to a lot of liberals at that time in the late 19th century. He believed that, yes, you could be liberal yourself, but it didn't mean giving power to all the people, because remember at that time, Russia, 90% of the population were serfs or former serfs, mostly illiterate. And so he didn't want to give power to all the people, because then it would just be the illiterate population might lose their power just to whoever was cunning in parliament, for example, members of the aristocracy or the middle classes. So he put off giving them, for example, a parliament, even though by this time Russia was falling behind not just all the countries in Europe like Germany, Austria, which also had parliaments, but even countries like Japan or the Ottoman Empire, who also had started parliaments. But two things changed in the year 1880. First of all, there was a terrorist attempt on his life. Terrorists managed to get into the Winter Palace, place a bomb under his dining room. The whole family would have been killed when the bomb went off, except the Empress's brother was visiting them from Germany. His train was late, and so they sat down 15 minutes late for lunch, and that's what saved them. And so he appointed a commission to look at how to deal with this terrorist threat. And one of his ministers, Loris Melikov, said to publish is to give power to the people to publish a constitution. At the same time, shortly after that, the Empress, his wife, died. Now, Alexander already had a second family with a woman, Catherine Dolgorukova, and who'd already given birth to his children. And straight after the period of mourning, he married her. This it was a morganatic marriage, but he wanted to make her empress and retire to live in the south of France with her. So what he planned to do was later in 1881, simultaneously, he would announce that Catherine would be crowned empress, and at the same time, he would grant a constitution to the people. And on the very day, 1st of March, 1881, when he signed off the constitutional project, and his new wife, Catherine, she even said to him, I'm so happy about this, and can I have the pen which you signed the document? It gives me greater pleasure to have a constitution than knowing a crown will be placed on my head, although whether that was true or not, another matter. And then later that day, he went out in his carriage and he was blown up and killed, blown up by terrorists, and brought back to the Winter Palace in several pieces, where he died. Now he was his son, now Alexander III, took over, and he was the complete opposite. He wasn't actually brought up to be the heir because he had an elder brother, Nicholas, who died of consumption, and so he was the second son, and he was completely opposed to democracy. He was very much pro-Russian, a Russian nationalist, which is, although he himself his mother was German, his father was half German, and he sacked all the previous Tsars, liberal ministers, wouldn't have anything to do with democracy. Although, as I said, there was a suggestion, maybe his coronation call a sort of Zemsky Sabor, an assembly of the land, which had been a sort of another old Russian parliament, but he wasn't having any of it. And although by this time, of course, this is the end of the 19th century, and he himself was married. He was the only Romanov Tsar to actually marry a member of a representative of constitutional democracy. His wife was Danish, Princess Dagmar, and she tried to influence him. It was mainly her father, King Christian IX of Denmark, tried to get her to influence Alexander to maybe not have at least have a not have a parliament, but at least maybe have a consultative organ. But he wasn't having any of it, and so by the time Russia reaches the 20th century and it's more or less frozen in time, there have been there's no democratic accountability, and all classes of society, liberals, workers, peasants, are wanting a share of power, but they're not being given it by the autocratic Tsar.
They're both so fascinating in the respect of how different they are and their different approaches. And I think you can definitely see some of those reflections in their characters in the future. But I also want to talk about probably one of Alexander III's biggest failings, and it might be unfair to say, but it's his son, Nicholas II. So Nicholas flirts with democracy in 1906, and you describe Russia under Nicholas as undergoing a transformation from an unlimited autocracy to an autocracy. So how and why did this process emerge, and what role does the Duma play in all of this?
Yes, so if there was a flirtation with democracy, it was a completely forced flirtation, because Nicholas II, he was also an anachronism. He was like his father. He didn't eat, even though all his relatives were members of Western constitutional democracies, he didn't want to grant any any power to his own people, but he was unable to stand up just to the pressures of time, because what happened was things came to a head in 1904 and 1905 when the disastrous Russian showing in the Russo-Japanese War. Then you'd Bloody Sunday in January 1905, when workers going to the palace were shot down, causing outrage across the whole country. And basically, throughout the whole of 1905, Russia was in the throes of revolution, and Nicholas was a prisoner in his own palace, basically. So the only way that he could quell the rebellion was by granting concessions. He could have become a military dictator, but he didn't have it in him to be this. And his relatives weren't going to do that for him. So he's forced to sign the October Manifesto, which grants wide-ranging civil rights to the population, and also creates a parliament called the Duma. Actually, it comes from the Russian verb "думать," which means to think, and it's from the same root as our own verb "to doom," meaning to pass judge or just pass judgment on, because this was what Nicholas hoped they would just pass judgment on, but they wouldn't actually start making laws themselves. But this was actually what happened, because now it wasn't, he didn't give the vote to everyone. It was limited to only men over the age of 25. And this was only around about 15% of the population, and it was weighted in favor of landowners and house owners against workers and peasants. Nevertheless, when elections were held in 1906, the Duma was very radical, and it was so radical that Nicholas ended up shutting it down after it had only passed one law. A second Duma was elected in 1907. This was even more radical and even more extremist, because it had extremists both on the left and on the far right as well. It was shut down also after just actually really after 103 days after it only passed 3 acts. And then Nicholas changed the voting law illegally to make it even harder to get radical deputies elected. Although, on the other hand, this was quite good, because what Russia needed was a period of evolution to slowly just get used to the workings of democracy. And the third and the fourth Dumas, which were both elected for 5 years, they operated for the full 5 years, and they worked, although they were more conservative, and this meant that again there was a little bit of this led to popular apathy because it wasn't so representative of the people. It did start working constructively with the Tsar's government to pass good laws, for example, on agriculture, on education, and things might have gone all right, working without any problems, but and so slowly evolving into a good relationship between the legislative and the executive. But two things happened. In 1911, the Prime Minister Stolypin was assassinated. Now, he'd been getting on very well with the Duma, and then also in 1911, the scandal of Rasputin started to emerge, and the Duma held its own inquiry into who was this person, why is he allowed access to the emperor, and this set them against Nicholas II, who objected to them, as he called, interfering in his private life. So the Fourth Duma, it was quite conservative, although it was beginning to move into opposition in 1914 against the emperor, and there was a case in March 1914, which was a little bit like what happened in England in 1641 under Charles I, when Charles I came down to Parliament, tried to arrest 5 MPs, but the Speaker and the whole of the House of Commons stood up against him, leading to the Civil War. And what happened was the leader of the Mensheviks gave a speech calling for a republic. Now, the government tried to prosecute him for this, but the case was dropped after all parties, even though they weren't Republicans in the Duma, supported him and passed a vote of no confidence in the Minister of the Interior. So this was like the beginnings of Parliament maybe trying to take its stand against the Tsar, act as one body. But then 1914, later in that year, you have the First World War, and the Duma, it passed patriotically passed the government budget, and then it dissolved itself for another year and basically gave all executive power for now until 1915 into the hands of the Tsar.
It's really interesting, like you know, drawing those parallels between what's happening under Charles I and what's happening under Nicholas, and how that Duma, despite interference, kind of sets itself up in opposition to Nicholas, who you know was a deeply unpopular figure at points, and how that leads to the collapse of Tsarism in Russia. Now, I think that's a great time for us to take our ad break, just so you can hear some message from our supporters. And me and Kenneth will be back to discuss Russia after the fall of Tsarism. Now, I am a massive history nut, hence why I have a podcast, hence why I learned so much about history outside of History of Jackson. And one place that I go to, and I really think you should go to as well, is to one of the sponsors of this show, which is the Past podcast with Veronica Fortune. Now, Past is the podcast about those who would never rule, which I think is an amazing concept, you know, learning about these people who we don't often talk about in history. And if you've ever been curious about why women couldn't inherit the throne of France, or, you know, why the 100 Years' War started, then this is the show for you. Veronica covers the almost kings and queens of history and the reasons why they would never rule. And I really think you're going to enjoy the Past podcast. And that's Past, Passed, the Past podcast with Veronica Fortune. I really think you're going to enjoy it. Go check it out. Now, here at History of Jackson, I absolutely love finding new places to access historical content. And I know that you need some more historical content to look and read. I also know that some of you are writers, you're looking to start your historical content creator journeys. And for me, one of the best places to start this is thehistorycorner.org or the History Corner blog on Instagram. Now, this is a great hub for creative people to begin their historical content creation journey. And it's a fantastic place for those who are interested in living history or photography to use to begin different methods of collaboration. This is a great place for everyone who's interested in history or involved in history. So that is thehistorycorner.org or the History Corner blog on Instagram. Go check it out. So thank you for staying with us after our ad break. And now we are back to talking to Kenneth about Russia post-Tsarism. So Kenneth, in 1917, 1918, we have a couple of difficult years for Russia. We have a series of revolutions. We have the introduction of democracy, and then the rise of the Bolsheviks. Can in a way that people can understand and touch on key points, can we kind of break down these 2 years because they are so hectic and crazy?
Yes, they were hectic, crazy, and as you say, difficult. On the other hand, they were good years in terms of, or the start was in terms of democracy. So I would even describe it, yes, difficult, but like the birth pangs, just as a birth is difficult and very painful, but gives birth to, to a baby, to something good, which unfortunately just wasn't allowed to continue. So very spontaneously in February 1917, people are tired of the war. Into third year of the war, people are tired. There are factory strikes. Workers are locked out on the streets. It's cold. There's a temporary problem with the bread distribution, and really discontent just boils over in the queues. And this might not have been anything particular, except that the Cossacks who were sent to disperse the crowds, they refused to obey orders, and they went over to the crowds. And basically, the regime just collapsed. Tsar's regime just basically collapsed. Country dissolved into anarchy. So there was a power vacuum. Fortunately, we had the Duma already in existence, and so as one one deputy, a man, Vasily Shulgin, said to the chairman of the Duma, Rodzianko, take power, because if you don't take power, others will. So the Duma appointed a provisional government, which its aim was to prepare the country for elections later that year to a constituent assembly, which would take all the decisions. Just like in France after the revolution, or America after the revolution, when they had constituent assemblies, this was to be the same in Russia. The only problem was that while they passed very free electoral laws, they immediately gave the vote to everyone, men, women, everyone over the age of 20, everyone in the armed forces. So if you were 16 or 18 in the armed forces, you also had the vote. Complete democracy. But the problem was they took too long to hold these elections. You really need to hold them very quickly after a revolution. But they waited until November of 1917 to actually hold the elections. And the problem was in October, a month before that, the Bolsheviks had seized power themselves in the capital of Petrograd. Now, the election still went ahead and they were very democratic. And we know they were democratic because the Bolsheviks didn't win the elections. Bolsheviks came second on about 22%. The winning party on about 40% was the Socialist Revolutionaries, who represented the peasants, the countryside. The Bolsheviks represented, first of all, the army and soldiers and also the workers. Now, when this parliament eventually met on the 5th of January 1918, it was at loggerheads with the Bolshevik would-be government. And it was only allowed to meet for one day, after which the Bolsheviks dispersed it by force of arms, and it never met again. And so the country descended into civil war. It began to break up. And as I said, you now had the Bolsheviks in power. Now they replaced, so instead of the Constituent Assembly, they said, now what was going to govern the country is the Soviets, also workers, soldiers, and peasant councils, where they had a majority. Now, this would have been quite possible in Russia. There wouldn't have been anything wrong with that because the Soviets were democratically elected, only not from the middle and upper classes, but though they were in a minority in the country anyway. But the problem was that there were an array of parties, the Socialist Revolutionaries, the Mensheviks, moderate socialists, who were also represented in these Soviets. And the Bolsheviks didn't want that at all. So very quickly, within 6 months of their own revolution in October 1917, in the summer of 1918, they expelled all the other socialist parties from the Soviets, and also they'd been in a coalition government with very left-leading socialist revolutionaries. They got rid of them, and so they either hunted down prominent politicians, there's red terror, using red terror, or they just, as I say, just banned the parties. So already by the middle of 1918, instead of the supposed dictatorship of the proletariat, which the Bolsheviks had pronounced, you've already got the dictatorship of the one communist party. And even inside the Communist Party, there was less and less democracy as time went on. In 1921, Lenin banned factions there. And also there was a rise, very quickly, there was a rise of a new bureaucratic elite in this ruling political party.
So you can really see, across those 2 years, the kind of collapse of what was developing into quite a accessible and open democracy into what would later become totalitarianism under Stalin. And we see with Stalin the complete antithesis to democracy, with his strongman, single man rule, albeit with that Politburo and that bureaucratic class assisting him. And in 1953, after years of terror from both himself and Lenin, Stalin dies, and his successor is Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev has a very, very different approach to both Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. How did he seek to implement democratic practices after such a intense totalitarian rule?
Yes, well, Khrushchev did it. He did it in a rather harebrained and haphazard, piecemeal manner, which is how he approached everything, which eventually led to his own overthrow in 1964. What he did was maybe a little bit like Gorbachev. It was part of his own political plan because obviously he had to uh, show that he was against the previous the old guard, the Stalinists, and so he did this by criticizing, first of all, 1956 at the 20th Party Congress, he criticized Stalin for his crimes against party members. Then the next, his 22nd Congress in 1961, he extended that criticism to Stalin's crimes against the whole Soviet people. And at the same time, he did try to introduce a lot of democratic changes in a way that even Gorbachev didn't plan at first. For start, in 1956, he even tried, it was a very small experiment when there was voting for just very minor party posts. He decided to, instead of having 57 people going for 57 posts, and just the electorate just having to say yes to the list, which was always elected, even if a couple of people said no. He made more people on the list than there were actually posts to introduce a little bit of competition. Although this was a disaster because quite like district party heads, they were the ones who missed out, and so they quickly put a stop to this experiment. And ironically, it was in the sort of ongoing march towards communism that led to Khrushchev thinking about democracy, because initially the Bolsheviks, it was dictatorship of the proletariat was the official ideology, but by the 1950s, you had socialism established by the 1930s, and this yeah, and so the USSR was already thinking about how it was going to implement actual communism, which was supposed to happen by the year they calculated by the year 1980. But Marx hadn't provided any blueprint as to what communism looked like. Khrushchev, he envisaged it be something like all-you-can-eat buffets that existed in capitalist countries combined with democracy. And at the same time, he started talking about democracy more and more because he pointed out how he visited America, and he pointed out how American presidents are limited to just 2 terms, whereas with us, it's only when people die they leave office. And so very on and off. It wasn't very consistent, but as time went on, in 1964 he visited Scandinavia, and the Scandinavian democracy seems to have impressed him quite a lot because when he was there, he was actually even overheard talking about a plan to maybe split the one communist party into 2 parties, one for the workers, one for the peasants. Now, this was the Soviet Union was a one-party state, but in, for example, countries like East Germany, China today, North Korea, they're not actually one-party states. There are other parties, but just they're not. They're never going to be real opposition. But if Khrushchev had done this in the Soviet Union, there was workers and peasants. There was a sort of a dichotomy. The 2 classes were slightly at odds, mainly over economic issues. Mainly due to having a command economy, and because even a command economy has to decide how resources are allocated, and there was a tension between workers and peasants when Khrushchev tried to help the peasants by putting up food prices in 1962. There was outrage across the country, and there was even a very small uprising in Novocherkassk in 1962, which was put down very brutally. And so when Khrushchev came back to Soviet Union after a Scandinavian visit in 1964, he announced that he was planning to write a new constitution. And he'd already set up a constitutional committee, and which there'd been various ideas floated, such as a two-chamber parliament, multi-candidate elections, reducing the time when people could serve, and no one really knew what. And then he would put this to the electorate in a referendum, which is, you just don't do it in a totalitarian state. So he went off on holiday to the Crimea, rather like Gorbachev later in 1991. And when he was there, he was called back by Brezhnev back to Moscow. On urgent business, and there at a meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee, he was removed from power. However, he was removed democratically, and I think he was about the only second person in the whole of Russian history to be removed from power and then actually to live out his days and not die a gruesome death.
It's for someone to implement these changes after Stalin and all the terror that he had gone about doing. It's an incredible amount of change for Russia to try and get through, and Khrushchev to try and push through. And you mentioned someone within telling us about Khrushchev, and that's Gorbachev. Now I want to touch on Gorbachev and Gorbachev's successor Boris Yeltsin a bit more, because there certainly are some parallels between Khrushchev and Gorbachev. And Gorbachev and Yeltsin are an incredibly interesting duo in terms of their relationship with democracy and in terms of what happens to Russia under the two of them. Would you mind unpacking their relationship and what happens between the two of them in regards to the overall picture of Russia?
Yes, and you're correct to say that Khrushchev was very important to Gorbachev, because Gorbachev knew that Khrushchev had been overthrown in 1964 by his own party, and that guided a lot of actually what he did. Now, Gorbachev came to power in 1985. He was a completely orthodox communist. He'd shown no signs of wanting to embark on any reforms, and if he had, he wouldn't have been appointed to the post of General Secretary, because although there was no democracy in the Soviet Union, even you still had to become General Secretary, you still had to be elected in the Politburo. Now, Gorbachev started out, he realized that things had to change, that the Soviet Union the economy was not in a very good place, and it was having to compete with Reagan's United States, which had embarked on the Star Wars program. And so he thought, well, he needs to change things a little bit, update the Soviet economy, mechanize it, introduce maybe robotization, computerization, but that was all. He said the Soviet system itself would make things happen, because he truly believed in communism. Problem was, these reforms had no effect at all. The real reason was because oil prices were falling at that time, hitting the Soviet economy very hard. They'd stayed afloat in the 70s from high oil prices, and now they suffered from low oil prices in the 1980s. But Gorbachev believed that he was facing sabotage from inside his party. And so what he thought he needed to do was to rely on forces outside the party, meaning the people. And he could only do so by bringing them into politics, and really so by having more democracy, giving them a share of power. At the same time, there was the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, which had all been covered up. And Gorbachev also saw that we also suffer from this lack of openness. So we need openness as well. We need to tell the truth about everything. Again, democracy. But the only problem was trying to do this in a totalitarian state. Maybe it just doesn't work. So at first, Gorbachev thought he was going back to the time of Lenin with the Soviets, and just not having alternative political parties, but just having more competition. So he tried a small experiment in 1988, which seemed to work. With like the elections that Khrushchev tried in 1956 were abandoned. So just local elections with multiple candidates seemed to be a great success. And so the following year, 1989, what they did, they passed a law on free elections. And so instead of the old Supreme Soviet, now they elected a whole new parliament called Congress of People's Deputies, which was democratically, or maybe at that time just like a transitional, semi-democratically elected. Basically, the Soviet Union was now a parliamentary democracy. So all this happening under Gorbachev, and as I say, he was a politician, and by providing this alternative power base, and the new Congress elected him as president of the USSR. This gave him another title, so even if he was removed as head of the party, he could still stay on as president of the USSR. And then at the same time, we've got Boris Yeltsin, who was interestingly going back to Novgorod. When Novgorod was invaded by Moscow in 1478, many of the people of Novgorod fled to Siberia, which was also controlled by Novgorod. And this is one of the ancestors of Yeltsin did that. And so Yeltsin was descended from one of those original people from Novgorod. He was also not, he was the party head in Sverdlovsk in the Urals. He was also a seemingly orthodox communist, but he was brought into Moscow by Gorbachev as part of Gorbachev's new team, and he quickly identified very much with glasnost and perestroika, and he came into conflict with Gorbachev because he felt Gorbachev was not doing enough. Now, at the same time, Yeltsin's also a politician, and he's also plotting to come to power himself. And he sees a chance for an alternative power base, not so much in the Union Center, which is controlled by Gorbachev, but in the Russian Republic itself, because as part of Gorbachev's reforms, you have a more devolution of power. And in 1990, after 1989, you had the first Congress for the whole of the Soviet Union. In 1990, you had the 15 republics also democratically elected their own congresses, their own parliaments. And the problem was now multiple parties were allowed, and in places in the Baltic countries, they elected separatist parties who immediately declared re-independence. And in Russia, Yeltsin and Democrats came to power, and Yeltsin saw that if he could use Russia as his power base in his political battle against Gorbachev. And this came to a head in 1991, August, the coup, which hardliners temporarily overthrew Gorbachev. And it was the Russian democratic officials who stood up to the coup. Yeltsin standing on a tank, and also supported by the Russian parliament. So after the coup was defeated, Gorbachev actually faced a second coup that year in December 1991, when Yeltsin went behind his back, met with the leaders Shushkevich of Belarusia and Kuchma of Ukraine, and set up their own independent, separate federation, which meant that the USSR was over, was no more. And that's I remember on the news bulletin that night, that was how they announced the headline news: the USSR is no more, no more.
And it's incredibly interesting, how the dynamic between these two men and their relationship with people from the past leads to the collapse of Russia. And Yeltsin certainly comes across as a very powerful and authoritative figure. You kind of have to be to stand on a tank, don't you? But I want to look further on. Yeltsin becomes president. He oversees and looks through the birth of a new democracy in Russia, and his successor, Vladimir Putin, kind of comes to the fray in the late 1900s and takes over in around 2000. Coming from relative obscurity, how does Vladimir Putin get to the point of being the successor, and then how does his presidency begin?
Yeah, so it was really just circumstances worked in such a way that Vladimir Putin came to power. The problem was with Yeltsin's corruption, or rather the corruption of his family in his second term in the late 1990s, meant that Yeltsin had to be sure that the next president would give him guarantees that he would not be jailed or in any case put on trial for his family's corruption. And he tried out various prime ministers, and the one who seems to have given him the answer that he wanted to hear was this man called Vladimir Putin, whom he appointed prime minister in August 1999. Incidentally, I remember it was just 2 days after the eclipse, which many people said it was going to bring in the end of the world, and we'll still see if that will happen. And yeah, as you say, I mean, Putin, we know that his first calling was in the KGB. And he'd been an operative in Leningrad and then in Dresden in East Germany, which ended when East Germany had its democratic revolution, and then he'd had to return to Leningrad. And then he affixed himself to the liberal, but actually quite corrupt mayor of Leningrad, then St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. And he was his vice mayor in St. Petersburg in the first half of the 1990s. Then when Sobchak lost his election, actually, in a large part, Putin was his electoral agent, and in a large part due to some part due to Putin's own efforts. Not meaning, I didn't mean that Putin was undermining him, more Putin's incompetence in being part of his electoral team. So when the mayor Sobchak lost his job in 1996, Putin was the only member of his team that didn't go to join the new mayor. He went off to Moscow and he got various administrative posts there in the Kremlin, and he did prove his loyalty. When Sobchak was going to be arrested on corruption charges, Putin helped him to get him out of the country to France. Putin also helped when Yeltsin also faced prosecution during his time as president. This was how democratic Russia was. Again, for corruption in the Kremlin, the reconstruction program, they set up. What happened was the prosecutor general was set up, and tape was shown on late night TV, because you couldn't show it to children, of someone who looked like the prosecutor general in company of prostitutes. And Putin, at that time, he'd been appointed head of the FSB, the security services. He said, yes, this video cassette is real, and authenticated it. So Yeltsin was able to sack him. And so in 1999, Putin is unveiled by Yeltsin as his heir successor. Now, just because Yeltsin said this, it was no guarantee that Putin would be elected president. He'd never stood for election himself before. But in the second half of 1999, several things happened. The war in Chechnya started up again when Chechnya invaded Dagestan. At the same time, in cities across Russia, there were bombings of apartments said to be done by Chechen terrorists. There's lots of it's hard to say one way or the other that claims if it was the Russian security services behind that or not. That's a separate topic. In whatever the case, Putin's ratings started to rise as he presented himself as a sort of strong man that would protect vulnerable Russians. And then finally, the elections weren't supposed to be held until summer of 2000, but Yeltsin resigned on Hogmanay 1999, bringing forward the elections by 3 months to March the year 2000. And actually in December 1999, just had a general election campaign, so all the other candidates had exhausted themselves financially and also physically. So this helped Putin. And he also used techniques which had been used for the first time to get Yeltsin re-elected in 1996, the media, spin, illicit funding, to get Putin over the line as president in March 2000. And although he'd said that he would continue the Yeltsin line in democracy, he immediately set about dismantling democracy. As I said, the media was very free at that time. 8 days after his election, the head of one of the media companies, Vladimir Brzezinski, who had the NTV, very anti-Kremlin, he was arrested. There were other crackdowns on the media. The Parliament, the lower parliament, the Duma, already basically had a sort of fake party which supported Putin, which had come to power following the December 1999 elections. There was also an upper house, but Putin also tamed that by reducing their privileges and also threatening the senators with corruption. He also tamed the oligarchs. Now, in a way, the oligarchs who'd become very rich during the privatization campaigns of the 1990s, they did need taming because they'd actually brought down a reformist government of Yeltsin in 1997. But the thing was, and so they were like a bad influence on democracy, so they did need taming. But what they weren't replaced by anyone; they were just told to keep out of. They weren't replaced by the people. Putin was sure that he made sure to control everything that was happening in political life in Russia. So even by the end of his very first year in power, year 2000, what was quite telltale was at the end of the year, he reinstated, there's a very symbolic act, reinstated the Soviet national anthem as the national anthem of Russia, which had been removed by Yeltsin. And so you saw on TV Yeltsin greeting the new year, having to listen to the anthem of this totalitarian state, which he thought he'd buried, but which was back again. And that's basically where we are today.
More than anything, like you've just mentioned, I think that reinstating of that anthem kind of does encapsulate where Russia went after the year 2000. That strengthening of strongman rule, the aversion to democracy, and it's really interesting to see these cycles of history repeat
Absolutely.
across Russian history. Now, I have a final fun question for you, as we do for all our guests here on the History of Jackson podcast. You bring a lot of stories about failed republics and democracies within Russia into your book. Which single one is your favourite and why?
It's a very hard question to answer because there were so many and so different. There was one that I liked particularly, which emerged in the far east of Russia in 1919 in the chaos of the Civil War. Because it was very representative. Its fate was very representative of the fall of democracy in general in Russia, and it's also very interesting and original in its own right. Now, it happened in Buryatia, which is actually a Buddhist part of Russia, very close to Mongolia. And it was called the Kudun state. It was It was a Buddhist theocracy, but it also had elements of constitutional democracy and Western republicanism. So it was like a mixture of Tibet and the United States of America. And it gave it was ahead of its time, because ahead of like the leading democracies of the world, because, for example, it gave the vote to everyone over the age of 15. Now, this is 1919, boys, girls, men, women. Now, if you look at Britain at that time, 1918, only some women double that age, over the age of 30, could get the vote in Britain. And they also had very interesting policies, such as, for example, the salaries of all public officials, including members of parliament, were set by the electorate. And you think that'd be a very interesting policy to have today. And also, but the way it ended was, as I said, it was quite representative, because this was during the Civil War. First of all, the problem was that it didn't have, it was a Buddhist state, it was a pacifist state, so it had everything that a modern state should have, but it didn't have an army because it was pacifist. And so it went through the same problem, like, for example, the Constituent Assembly in 1918, which wasn't able to stand up to the Bolsheviks using force of arms. This lack of an army led to its demise. So first of all, it was overthrown by the invading white forces, and then the whites were defeated by the Reds, who also imprisoned the head of state, the Buddhist. And people think of the Russian Civil War as a battle between just the Reds and the Whites, but there's actually a third element. There were the Democrats, supporters of democracy, and both the Whites and the Reds were enemies of democracy. None of them wanted democracy. So in a way, this whole state, it was quite representative. But yes, all these very small states, I find it all these small republics, democracies, which were set up by the people themselves over Russian history, I find it very poignant. And just to finish off, you mentioned Russian history going in cycles there. That actually reminds me, there was also a very small, it was a peasant republic set up in 1905, during the 1905 revolution, in the village of Stary Buyan, near the city of Samara. And it set up a a direct democracy known as the Stary Buyan Republic, and it had a 5-article constitution, but it only lasted 13 days. And after it was overthrown by the Tsarist forces, one of the peasants said, "Our People's Republic lasted only 13 days. For 13 days, the sun shone, but then it disappeared again behind the impenetrable clouds of the autocratic regime." And in a way, that's almost like an epithet for the story of democracy in Russia. Maybe 13 days, just for a very short period, the sun shines very brightly, but then it goes behind the clouds again.
I certainly found both of those republics when I was reading your book incredibly interesting, especially the Buddhist one, which I thought was just so fascinating in terms of how it was set up and its different procedures in its democracy as well. Now, as always, people are going to want to read your book. It's incredibly informative of the current political climate. It can help inform people of the different historical contexts for the conflict that's currently happening in Ukraine. And it can help people contextualize some of the rhetoric coming from Putin and Russia regarding the conflict. So, where can people find your book?
Yeah, I would say in all good bookshops, Blackwell's, Waterstones, and also other independent bookshops. Also, you can always get it from my publisher, Amberley. I also think Amberley publish very good books on history, and I think they give a discount if you spend more than £100. You get free postage. Books sometimes on special offer with Amberley. So if you go to their website, you can definitely get it there. And just all other book selling websites. I would just, if you want to buy online, just look around to see where you can get the best price.
Yeah, and I certainly want to thank Amberley for sending me a copy of your book. It's been really great to read it, and I have seen your book in Waterstones as well. So I encourage anyone to head across to Waterstones and grab a copy of Kenneth's book. Now, people are also going to want to find you and read about some of the things that you're writing about and researching. Where can they find you?
Well, I have a website, rusartnet.com, where it's possible to contact me there. Otherwise, I can be contacted always through the publishers, Amberley. They're very, very good, very responsive. So I think if you've any particular question, just write to Amberley, and I'll be happy to answer and engage.
And I know people are going to want to get in contact with you, so it's great to find those websites. And I will agree, Amberley are really on it when it comes to email. So if you have any questions, do certainly email through them. Now, thank you very much for coming on, Kenneth. I've really enjoyed our discussion. I've learned so much today.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions, and I've really enjoyed going on this tour of Russian history with you as well. I enjoy your podcast very much. I'm surprised there's not more like them. The format is very popular in Russia. I know I love watching the sort of Russian equivalent, and they have millions of viewers. So I also wish you the equivalent.
Oh, thank you very much, Kenneth. That's really kind of you. And I certainly hope that I'd have 1 million followers one day. So now, thank you guys. Now, if you enjoy listening to the History of Jackson podcast and the content that I create, do consider subscribing to Past and Present Plus on Apple Podcasts. It will help me as a creator continue to do what I do and get the time to produce and edit these podcasts. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you all next episode.